What medieval soldiers ate before going to war was not a matter of luxury, but survival and practicality. Armies on the move needed food that could be stored, carried, and shared without spoiling quickly. Bread, cheese, salted meat, porridge, and ale formed the foundation of a soldier's diet, while the exact mix depended on rank, geography, and available supplies. Knights often had access to fresher and finer foods, while ordinary infantry relied on preserved rations and whatever could be boiled in a pot. These meals were more than nourishment. They were part of preparation, discipline, and morale, shaping how soldiers faced the hardships of marching and the dangers of battle. Number 1. The daily bread of soldiers. In every medieval camp, before the noise of armor and the orders to form ranks, men reached for bread first. It was the thing you could count on. Simple, filling, and easy to share. Most soldiers weren't biting into soft bakery loaves. They ate sturdy bread that could survive rain, mud, and rough travel. In many regions that meant loaves mixed from cheaper grains: barley, rye, oats, or a blend called maslin, where wheat and rye were ground together. Wheat was prized but not always practical. Rye handled cold and damp better. Barley grew in poor soils, and oats were common in the north and uplands. The exact grain told you a lot about where an army had marched and what the fields around them could supply. Towns and garrisons relied on fixed bakehouses with big clay or stone ovens, but moving armies had to be creative. If they stayed in one spot long enough, they threw up temporary ovens from clay and turf. If they were on the move, they baked flatter breads on hot stones or iron griddles, or they bought from local bakers under pressure from officials who had the power to requisition. Millers mattered as much as swordsmen. Flour came from watermills along rivers, windmills on breezy ridges, or hand querns when nothing else was available. Coarse flour came straight from the mill. Finer, whiter flour was bolted through cloth, a luxury that cost time and money. The finer the sift, the higher the status. Knights and well-off retainers chased lighter loaves that were easier on the stomach. Foot soldiers usually got the darker, denser kind that kept you full. Leavening usually came from brewing. Bakers skimmed balm-frothy yeast from ale vats to raise dough, giving many loaves a faint beer tang. When yeast ran short, sourdough starters kept the process alive. Salt was precious but essential. Without it, bread spoiled faster and tasted flat. In wet weather, mold was a real enemy, and soldiers learned to dry slices near the fire or toast them into sops to stretch a stale loaf another day. Bread wasn't just something to chew. It shaped how people ate. Thick slices doubled as trenchers' edible plates to hold stew or meat juices. After a meal, the soaked bread fed hungry comrades, the poor who followed the camp, or sometimes the dogs. Crumbled bread thickened pottage, turning thin broth into something that stuck to your ribs. Soldiers dunked it in ale when teeth were missing, or the crust was rock hard. In the field, a chunk of bread with a wedge of cheese or a smear of rendered fat was more useful than a fancy dish you couldn't carry. Bread also worked as a ration you could count, weigh, and divide without arguments. Pay clerks measured out loaves, because scales, measures, and records kept order in a crowd that depended on predictable food. An army ex-mood lived or died on those deliveries. If the ovens ran and the millstones turned, men stayed calm. If the bread carts lagged, grumbling started, and discipline frayed quickly. Commanders knew this and pushed bread to the front of the supply line. Grain travels better than meat, and flour packs tighter than live animals, so logistics favored bread from the start. Before a fight, nobody wanted a heavy gut, but nobody wanted to swing a sword on an empty stomach either. The practical solution was familiar: a measured portion of bread for quick energy, often with a bit of cheese or a ladle of warm pottage to make it go down easier. Knights might get finer loaves. Common spearmen got the coarse rounds. The result was the same steady energy without slowing you down. Regional habits colored the taste. In the German lands, rye loaves were common and kept well. In northern France and England, mixed grain breads showed up everywhere among ordinary people, while white loaves appeared at noble tables and in well-supplied towns. In the Mediterranean, flatbreads and wheat bread were more common, and armies moving along the coast leaned on local bakeries and stores. Crusading forces learned fast that your bread depends on the countryside you cross and the mills you can reach safely. Bread's role shows up even in laws and records. Towns policed bakers, watched loaf sizes, and tied prices to grain costs to prevent riots. Military purveyors. Those officials who gathered supplies cut through red tape by force of law, buying or seizing grain and fuel to keep ovens hot. You can picture the scene in a march. Carts with sacks of grain, charcoal burners and woodcutters trailing behind, smiths fixing oven doors, bakers working at night so that dawn brought warm loaves and quieter men. Nutrition was basic but effective. Bread delivered fast-burning energy that kept feet moving and arms steady. The coarse versions brought fiber and a touch of protein from the grain itself. When paired with beans or peas in pottage, the mix covered more bases. Nobody talked about carbohydrates or amino acids, but soldiers knew what kept them upright. Bread also shaped camp rhythms. Men lined up for rations, tore loaves by hand, shared crusts with friends, and stashed leftovers in bags against the next long march. They swapped tricks, slice it thin, and toast it if it's turning, scrape the mold and dry it hard, crumble it into the pot to make stew feel like a meal. Number 2. Meat for strength. In the Middle Ages, soldiers understood that bread filled the stomach, but meat gave real strength for the exhausting demands of war. Protein and fat were the building blocks of endurance, and armies that could secure a steady supply of meat stood a better chance of keeping men healthy and disciplined. Yet, how much meat a soldier ate, and in what form, depended heavily on his rank, the wealth of his lord, the geography of the campaign, and the state of supply lines. For knights and nobles, meat was more common, and often fresher. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and game animals such as deer or wild boar could appear on their tables even in camp. Their retainers, cooks, and huntsmen helped secure better cuts of beef or venison, sometimes supplemented by poultry. For foot soldiers and levies, the situation looked different. They ate meat less often, and when they did, it was usually in the form of preserved pork, salted beef, or dried fish. The contrast reflected social hierarchy. What a knight considered a routine meal could be a rare treat for a common archer. Preservation shaped the way soldiers consumed meat on campaign. Salting was the dominant method, with barrels of pork or beef packed tightly and carried with the baggage train. These salted slabs were durable, but extremely tough and salty, so soldiers usually boiled them in water, ale, or pottage to soften the flesh. Smoking was common in Northern Europe, producing bacon and ham that lasted longer and could be sliced thin. Dried meat, what we would recognize today as jerky, was easy to carry in a pouch and could be chewed during marches. Fresh meat, when available, usually came from animals driven with the army. Herds of cattle, sheep, or goats followed the baggage, and butchers slaughtered them before major engagements. This ensured that the men had at least one nourishing meal rich in fat and protein before entering battle. The choice of meat reflected geography as well. In England and France, beef and pork were dominant. In Mediterranean campaigns, lamb and goat were more common, and crusading armies often adapted their diets to local availability, including camel or horse when desperate. Fish also played a vital role, especially during fast days when religious rules forbade flesh meat. Armies carried barrels of salted herring, cod, or eels, which provided variety and preserved protein when livestock was scarce. Religious restrictions were taken seriously, but commanders often looked the other way in the face of military necessity. Few men were asked to march hungry simply to honor a fast day. The symbolism of meat mattered almost as much as its nutritional value. Distributing fresh meat before battle was a deliberate act by commanders, reminding soldiers that they were cared for and prepared. Chroniclers describe how a meal of beef or pork lifted morale, creating a sense of unity across the camp. Men cooked together in groups, pooling rations into communal stews. These shared meals built camaraderie, easing fears and reinforcing bonds between comrades. The smell of roasting meat across a camp before dawn must have been powerful, carrying both reassurance and anticipation. Nutritionally, meat gave more than energy. Iron from red meat helped prevent fatigue, while fat from pork provided dense calories essential for men who marched miles in armor and then fought for hours. Rendered fat was stored as lard and used to fry or enrich pottage. Bones and scraps, given to lower-ranking soldiers, were boiled into broths that delivered both calories and comfort. Nothing was wasted. In this way, meat served not just the knightly elite, but the entire army, even if in different forms and qualities. Logistically, supplying meat required careful planning. Herding animals across long distances risked losing weight or even death from exhaustion. Butchers in the army played an official role, ensuring animals were slaughtered, divided, and preserved efficiently. Records from medieval campaigns show how expensive this process was. Armies needed